The text from the Rapid City Police Department still haunts my dream. Professor Morrison, we've found no trace of Lily in the Badlands. Search suspended after 72 hours. I need to share this warning, even though my hands shake uncontrollably every time I think about those cursed rocks. Nobody believed my story about what really happened that night in Sage Creek Wilderness area, but perhaps writing it down will help someone avoid my fatal mistake. I was arrogant, too focused on my geological research to see the sign. Why didn't I listen to the ranger's warnings about the ancient Dakota legends? I should have known something was wrong when we first arrived at that isolated camping spot. The Winnebago's GPS had stopped working miles ago, and the strange formations surrounding us looked nothing like the typical Badlands erosion patterns I'd studied for decades. Lily noticed it first, the unnatural silence. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to watch our every move. Her intuition was always sharper than mine, but I dismissed her concerns as typical teenage anxiety about our father-daughter bonding trip. The ranger we met at the entrance station had tried to warn us. Professor or not, there are things about these rocks that science can't explain, he'd said, his weathered face grave as he glanced at the darkening sky. The Lakota elders speak of ancient spirits trapped within the stone, awakening during the new moon to feed on family bonds. I'd smiled politely, mentally filing it away as local folklore. Perfect material for engaging my students next semester. Now I understand he wasn't sharing legend. He was trying to save our lives. The first truly inexplicable thing happened as we were setting up camp. I'd been documenting some unusual striations in the nearby rock face, patterns that defied all known geological processes. When Lily called me over to look at something, she'd found what appeared to be ancient petroglyphs, but they were wrong somehow. The images seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, and they depicted something that made my blood run cold. Humanoid figures being absorbed into the rock formations while larger, darker shapes emerged from the stone. That evening, as the sun set behind the jagged horizon, I made the decision that would haunt me forever. Despite Lily's growing unease and the ranger's warning, I insisted we stay. This could be a major discovery, I'd argued. Setting up my research equipment near the largest formation. Think about it. Unexpected geological formations, unknown petroglyphs, unique mineral composition. This could be revolutionary. Lily had given me that look, the same one she'd given me when I missed her piano recital last year. Too busy with my research. If I'd only listened to her then, she might still be here now. The changes began subtly as darkness fell. The temperature dropped rapidly, far below what was normal for a summer night in the Badlands. Inside our Winnebago, Lily wrapped herself in a blanket while I reviewed the day's geological samples. The rocks I'd collected seemed different somehow. Darker, denser, with an oily sheen that hadn't been visible in daylight. When I tried to photograph them, every image came out distorted, as if the stones were moving between frames. Strange sounds started echoing across the wilderness, not the usual nighttime noises of the Badlands, but something deeper, more rhythmic. It reminded me of stone grinding against stone, yet somehow melodic, almost like chanting. Lily heard it too, pressing her hands against her ears. "Dad, something's wrong with the rocks," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're singing." I assured her it was just the wind, but I couldn't explain why our Winnebago's instruments showed absolutely no air movement outside. The first major sign that we were in danger came when our camping lights began to flicker and die. Despite having fresh batteries, the darkness that flooded in wasn't natural. It seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence, particularly around the rock formations outside. Through the RV's windows, I could have sworn the stones were changing shape, their surfaces rippling like liquid in the moonless night. Lily grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Dad, look at the petroglyphs," she gasped. The ancient drawings we'd photographed earlier were moving, the figures writhing across the rock face. Our phones lost signal simultaneously, screens displaying impossible errors before going completely dark. The Winnebago's engine wouldn't start, and every electronic device we had began to malfunction. The temperature inside the RV continued to plummet until we could see our breath. Lily huddled closer to me, and I finally admitted to myself that we were experiencing something far beyond my scientific understanding. Maybe we should try to walk out, she suggested. But when I looked outside, the landscape had changed. The rock formations had shifted position, creating an impossible maze around our campsite. That's when we heard it, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from within the rocks themselves. It wasn't just noise, it was a voice, ancient and hungry, speaking in a language that hurt our ears and made our heads spin. The rocks around us began to glow with a pale, sickly light, and in their surfaces, we could see faces forming, twisted, agonized expressions that appeared and disappeared like waves on water. Lily screamed, and I finally understood the true meaning of the petroglyphs we'd found. They weren't warnings or historical records. They were a promise of what was to come. Everything happened so fast after that. The ground beneath our Winnebago began to tremble, not like an earthquake, but more like something massive shifting beneath the earth. The rock formations had completely encircled us now, their surfaces rippling and flowing like heavy liquid. In the otherworldly light they emitted, I could see shapes moving within them, human shapes, trapped like insects in amber, their faces contorted in eternal screams. Lily was the first to notice that the rocks were actually moving closer, slowly but steadily closing in around our RV. The mechanical grinding sound had grown louder, now accompanied by what sounded like whispers in an ancient language. Through the windows, we watched in horror as smaller rocks began to flow together like mercury, forming larger masses that pulsed with that sickly inner light. The temperature had dropped so low that frost was forming on the inside of our window, creating patterns that looked disturbingly like the petroglyphs we'd found earlier. I tried everything I could think of to protect us. The RV's engine was dead, but I still had road flares in our emergency kit. When I lit one, the rocks actually recoiled, retreating a few feet before resuming their advance. The brief illumination revealed something that turned my blood to ice. There were fresh petroglyphs forming on the rock surfaces, depicting our Winnebago and two figures inside it. As I watched, the images began to move, showing the rocks consuming the vehicle and its occupants. The entity within the stones was toying with us, I realized. It had done this before, countless times throughout history, feeding on the terror and desperation of parents and children. In the shifting surfaces of the rocks, I began to see visions, other families, other victims spanning centuries, Native Americans, settlers, modern tourists, all trapped within the ancient stone, their bonds of kinship providing the energy that sustained the horror lurking within. The whispers grew stronger, and to my horror, I realized I could understand them now. That's when Lily made her fatal mistake. "Dad," she said, her voice strange and distant, "I think I know how to stop them." Before I could react, she had opened the RV's door and stepped outside, holding her phone up like a shield. The screen had come back to life, displaying impossible symbols that matched the ones on the rocks. The formations seemed to pause, vibrating with some new energy. "The patterns," she called back to me, her voice filled with a terrible certainty. "They're not just drawings, they're a key." I lunged for her, but I was too late. The rocks surged forward like a wave, and in an instant, my daughter was gone. I don't remember much of what happened immediately after Lily disappeared. I know I ran outside, screaming her name until my voice gave out. The rocks had retreated to their original positions, once again appearing as normal Badlands formations. But now I could see the truth, the subtle wrongness in their angle, the way shadows moved across their surfaces even without light, the faces that appeared and vanished when viewed from the corner of my eye. Lily's phone lay on the ground where she had stood, its screen cracked but still displaying those impossible symbols. The next few hours were a blur of desperate attempts to find her. I used the road flares to keep the rocks at bay while I searched, but deep down, I knew it was useless. The ancient entity had taken her, just as it had taken countless others before. In the pre-dawn light, I found more petroglyphs, freshly formed in the stone. They showed a girl being absorbed into the rock, becoming one with the ancient spirits trapped within. But there was something different about these images. They showed the girl holding what looked like a modern device, and the symbols around her were unlike any of the others. When the search teams finally arrived, led by the ranger who had warned us, they found me sitting in the Winnebago, clutching Lily's phone. The device was dead now, the strange symbols gone, but I had memorized every detail. The ranger didn't seem surprised by my story, though the police obviously didn't believe me. The Dakota elders speak of a cycle, he explained quietly while the others searched the area. Every new moon, the spirits hunger for the energy of family bonds, but they've never encountered someone who could read their language before. That's when I noticed something had changed in the rock formation. The faces I glimpsed in their surfaces were different now, younger, more familiar. Sometimes, when the light hits them just right, I swear I can see Lily's features in the stone, not trapped or suffering like the others, but transformed, aware, waiting. The symbols on her phone weren't a warning or a cry for help. They were instructions. My daughter had understood something about the ancient entity that no one else had in centuries of encounters. The ranger was the only one who seemed to grasp the significance of what had happened. While the police filed their missing persons report and the search teams combed the area, he shared what he knew of the Dakota legend. The spirits in the rocks weren't just hungry ghosts, he explained, but guardians of an ancient knowledge. Those they took weren't simply victims. They became part of something vast and incomprehensible. I found a small comfort in his words, but they helped explain the last text message I found in Lily's phone draft folder. Dad, I understand now. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be joined. I've spent the last 3 months analyzing everything that happened that night, trying to understand what Lily discovered in those final moments. The symbols she saw, the connection she made with the ancient entity. It wasn't random, my daughter, who had grown up surrounded by geological theories and scientific explanations, had somehow deciphered something that generations of scholars and shamans had missed. The petroglyphs weren't just a record of the entity's victims, they were a complex language, a dialogue between our world and whatever exists within those cursed rocks. The police officially closed Lily's case last week, filing it as another unexplained disappearance in the Badlands. They don't want to hear about moving rocks or ancient spirits, but the ranger visits me sometimes, bringing books of Dakota legends and introducing me to elders who have their own stories about the Sage Creek Wilderness area. They speak of cycles and transformations, of knowledge that comes with a terrible price. Some of them look at me with pity, others with something close to reverence. They understand that my daughter didn't just vanish, she transcended. I've returned to the site several times since that night, always during the full moon when the entity sleeps. The rock formations look normal to casual observers, but I know better now. I can see the subtle shifts in their surfaces, the way they respond to my presence. Sometimes, when I place my hand on the stone, I feel a familiar warmth, a connection that both comforts and terrifies me. The new petroglyphs are still there, showing Lily with her phone, but they've changed slightly. Now they show her teaching, sharing something with the ancient spirits, becoming something more than human. This is why I finally decided to share my story, not just as a warning, but as a testament to what my daughter discovered. The Badlands hold secrets far older and stranger than any geological study could reveal. The entity in the rocks isn't just a mindless, force-consuming family bond. It's a guardian of knowledge so profound it can only be understood by becoming part of it. Lily didn't just solve the mystery. She embraced it, becoming something beyond my comprehension. The symbols on her phone weren't a key to escape. They were an invitation to evolve. So here is my final warning to anyone planning an RV trip to the Badlands. Stay away from Sage Creek Wilderness area during the new moon. If you see rocks that seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them, drive away immediately. And if you find petroglyphs that seem to move in the darkness, don't try to understand them. Some mysteries demand more than just our curiosity. They demand everything we are. I lost my daughter to this ancient knowledge, but perhaps she found something greater than I could ever give her. The rocks still whisper at night, and sometimes in my dreams I hear Lily's voice among them, speaking in that impossible language, waiting for others who are ready to understand. I've spent my entire career as a wildlife veterinarian trying to understand nature's patterns, but nothing in my studies could have prepared me for what we encountered in the Everglades. The research committee dismissed my findings as stress-induced hallucination, but I know what I saw. I need to warn others about what lurks in the remote sections of Shark Valley Slough. Especially during the full moon, Sarah would want me to share this. Assuming that thing that came back to our RV that night was really Sarah. The expedition started normally enough. Our Airstream Bambi handled the rough access roads surprisingly well, its modified suspension taking the punishment of the uneven terrain. Sarah was excited about photographing the rumored new species, her cameras ready to document everything we found. We'd been best friends since college, sharing a passion for wildlife that had only grown stronger over the years. The local reports of an unknown reptile species had drawn us both here. But we should have paid more attention to the other stories, the ones about people going missing. The first warning came from an old Mikosuke fisherman we met at the last supply stop. His weathered face had grown serious when we mentioned our destination. The geometric markers are their territory, he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. They use decay to create, and during the full moon, they hunt for new patterns to copy. We'd smiled politely, attributing his warnings to local superstition. Sarah had even taken his photo for her cultural documentation series. Now, I can't look at those images without seeing the genuine fear in his eyes. The Everglades welcomed us with its usual symphony of life. Bird calls, rustling vegetation, the occasional splash of something entering the water. But as we ventured deeper into Shark Valley Slough, the familiar sounds began to change. The water took on an oily sheen that didn't match any algal bloom I'd studied, and the air carried a sweet, rotting smell that didn't fit the environment's natural decomposition processes. Sarah noticed it too, her camera constantly capturing details that seemed slightly wrong. Though we couldn't quite explain why, we found the first inexplicable carcass that afternoon as a veterinarian specializing in wildlife. I'd seen every kind of animal death the Everglades could produce, but this was different. The alligator's body showed signs of decomposition that should have taken months to develop, yet the surrounding vegetation indicated it had died less than a day ago. More disturbing were the perfectly geometric patterns etched into its scale, as if something had been studying its structure. Sarah photographed everything while I took samples, neither of us realizing we were being watched from beneath the murky water. The sun was setting when we found the perfect camping spot, a relatively dry patch of ground surrounded by deeper water. The elevation would keep us safe from local wildlife, or so we thought. As I maneuvered our Airstream into position, Sarah spotted something unusual in the mud. Perfect circles and triangles, each exactly identical, stretched across the ground in an intricate pattern that seemed to ripple outward from a central point. My scientific mind tried to rationalize it as human-made survey marker, but the patterns were far too precise, too complex. The strangeness escalated as darkness fell. Our equipment began registering impossible reading, temperature fluctuations that violated thermodynamic laws, electromagnetic disturbances that made our instruments useless. Sarah's cameras started malfunctioning, showing corrupted images filled with geometric shapes that hadn't been there when she took the photo. The patterns in the mud seemed to shift when viewed through our cameras, forming new configurations that hurt our eyes to look at. We should have left immediately, but scientific curiosity overwhelmed our growing unease. That night, the full moon cast an eerie glow over the swamp, reflecting off the water in ways that defied physics. The geometric patterns began to emit a faint luminescence, pulsing in sync with something we could feel but not quite hear. Sarah insisted on setting up her time-lapse equipment to document the phenomenon. We watched through the RV's windows as the mud around us seemed to breathe, the patterns slowly expanding and contracting like a giant organism's circulatory system. The sweet, rotting smell had grown stronger, and with it came a deep sense of wrongness. The local wildlife's behavior became increasingly erratic. We observed alligators swimming in perfect geometric formation, birds arranging themselves in impossibly symmetric patterns. Through my binoculars, I noticed that some of the animals moved in ways that seemed mechanical, artificial. Sarah's photos revealed more disturbing details, creatures that appeared normal at first glance but showed signs of being hollow, like biological puppets being controlled by something else. In one particularly chilling image, we could see multiple copies of the same bird, each identical down to the smallest feather pattern. It was Sarah who made the connection first. The decomposition patterns we'd observed earlier, the geometric shapes, the copied animals, they were all parts of a larger pattern we couldn't quite comprehend. "Emma," she whispered, pointing to her laptop screen. "Look at the time-lapse footage." The video showed the mud patterns slowly converging toward our RV, forming what looked like a massive spiral, but more disturbing were the shapes moving within the water. Things that rose partially above the surface displaying perfect copies of local wildlife before sinking back into the depths. We realized too late that we weren't observing the phenomenon. It was observing us. Everything changed at midnight. The moon reached its zenith, and the geometric patterns in the mud began to glow with an intense, sickly light. The water around our camping spot had become completely still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. But beneath that perfect surface, we could see movement, shapes that shouldn't exist, patterns that hurt our minds to look at. Sarah was outside, trying to capture the phenomenon with her infrared camera, when we heard the first sound, a wet, slithering noise accompanied by what seemed like whispered equations. The temperature dropped suddenly, condensation forming on every surface in impossible fractal pattern. Through the Airstream's windows, I watched in horror as the mud began to move independently of any water flow, forming three-dimensional shapes that rose and fell like living architecture. Sarah's camera caught something emerging from the center of the spiral pattern, a mass of decomposed matter that moved with terrible purpose, reconstructing itself using geometric principles that violated every natural law I knew. The sweet, rotting smell had become overwhelming, and with it came a deep understanding of what we were witnessing. This thing, this entity, wasn't just copying life. It was studying it, breaking it down to its component patterns and rebuilding it according to its own impossible mathematics. The missing persons reports, the strange animal behavior, the decomposition anomalies, they were all connected. We were watching something ancient that had evolved beyond organic life, using decay as a tool to understand and replicate the patterns of living things. Sarah's photos would later reveal fragments of human shapes within the mass, perfect copies frozen in poses of terror and fascination. That's when Sarah made her fatal mistake. "We need a closer look," she said, her voice strange and distant. "Think about it, Emma. We're witnessing the next step in evolution." Before I could stop her, she had moved closer to the water's edge, her camera recording everything. The patterns in the mud shifted, forming a perfect circle around her feet. I screamed a warning, but she seemed entranced by what she was seeing through her viewfinder. The last photo on her camera, recovered later, shows the moment the surface tension of the water broke, not in a splash, but in a geometric explosion of perfectly calculated drops. I remember running toward her, but the mud beneath my feet had become like quicksand, forming precise geometric pockets that made movement impossible. The thing that rose from the water defied description, a massive framework of decayed matter arranged in impossible pattern, displaying fragments of every creature it had ever studied. At its center, I caught a glimpse of what looked like human shapes, perfectly preserved but wrong somehow. like three-dimensional photographs taken from multiple angles simultaneously. Sarah's scream cut off abruptly, and when the thing retreated back into the water, she was gone. Only her camera remained, floating on the surface, its screen displaying an endless loop of geometric pattern. The next few hours were a nightmare of isolation and paranoia. The patterns in the mud had retreated, leaving perfect circles of dry ground that seemed to mock natural geometry. I had barricaded myself inside the airstream, trying desperately to contact anyone on our satellite phone, but all I got was a strange harmonic tone that seemed to form mathematical sequences. The RV's electronics were malfunctioning, displays showing impossible readings and fragments of geometric patterns that matched those outside. I was alone with the growing certainty that whatever lived in these waters was far older and more alien than anything science had prepared me for. Around 3 a.m., I heard Sarah's voice calling from outside. She was standing there in the moonlight, completely dry, smiling that familiar smile. But something was wrong. Her movements were too precise, her posture too symmetrical. When she spoke, her words seemed to follow mathematical patterns, subtle rhythms that made my skin crawl. "Let me in, Emma," she said, her voice a perfect reproduction of my friend's. "I've seen something wonderful. The patterns, they make sense now. Everything makes sense." I watched through the window as she moved closer, her feet leaving geometric impressions in the mud that spiraled outward with perfect mathematical precision. The thing that looked like Sarah spent hours trying to convince me to open the door. It knew everything she knew, every memory, every inside joke, every secret we'd shared. But its perfection was its flaw. The real Sarah had a slight limp from an old hiking accident, but this copy moved with flawless symmetry. Its smile never wavered. Its blinking followed a precise pattern, and when it grew frustrated, its face rearranged itself in geometric variations of human expression. I watched in horror as it occasionally glitched, its form momentarily revealing the mathematical framework beneath the copied flesh. Dawn brought a new horror. As the sun rose, I could see other things moving in the water, perfect copies of local wildlife arranged in impossible formation. Birds flew in geometric patterns that ignored aerodynamics. Alligators moved with mechanical precision. Even the insects seemed to dance in mathematical sequences. The copy of Sarah had retreated to the water's edge, where it stood perfectly still, its shape occasionally rippling like a reflection in disturbed water. Through my binoculars, I could see other human figures in the deeper water, all identical, all moving with that same terrible precision. What happened next still haunts my dreams. As the morning sun hit the water, the thing that looked like Sarah began to decay rapidly, but not in any natural way. Its form dissolved into geometric patterns that flowed back into the water, leaving behind perfect mathematical impressions in the mud. But before it completely disappeared, it turned to look at me one last time. Its face had become a symmetric arrangement of what looked like catalog photos of Sarah, each one showing a slightly different angle, all moving independently. "We'll perfect it eventually," it said, in a voice that was both Sarah's and something else entirely. "Every pattern, every possible variation, you'll see us again, and next time, we'll be indistinguishable." The rescue team found me 2 days later, dehydrated and babbling about geometric patterns and perfect copies. They didn't believe my story, of course. The official report lists Sarah as missing, presumed drowned, another statistic in the dangerous swamps of the Everglades. They dismissed the geometric patterns in the mud as airboat tracks, ignored the perfectly preserved animal carcasses arranged in mathematical sequences, and attributed my story to heat exhaustion and grief. But I know what I saw, and I know they're still out there, studying, copying, perfecting their reproductions. I've spent months analyzing Sarah's recovered camera, freezing frames that show glimpses of what really lives in those waters. The geometric patterns appear in every photo, becoming more complex over time, as if the entity was learning, evolving its understanding of organic structures. More disturbing are the background details. Perfectly identical birds in impossible numbers, repeating patterns in the vegetation that nature doesn't produce, and sometimes just at the edge of the frame. Human figures standing in the water, all identical, all wrong in subtle ways that the conscious mind refuses to process. The old Mikosuke fisherman found me last week. He wasn't surprised by my story. His people have known about the entities for generations, watching as they learned to copy first plants, then animals, and finally humans. They don't understand life, he told me, only patterns. Each copy is an experiment, an attempt to perfectly replicate something they can never truly comprehend. He showed me ancient drawings depicting geometric shapes rising from the water, surrounded by identical figures. The patterns matched exactly what Sarah had photographed. This thing had been studying us for centuries, getting better at its copies with each attempt. I'm writing this warning because I know they're getting closer to perfection. Each time they copy something, the replication is more accurate, more convincing. The geometric patterns have been spreading, appearing in other parts of the Everglades. Park rangers have reported finding identical animal carcasses miles apart, arranged in precise mathematical formations. Tourists have shared photos of impossible wildlife behavior, perfect symmetries that nature never intended. And sometimes, just sometimes, people report seeing multiple copies of the same person, each one moving with terrible precision, each one studying the humans around them with mechanical fascination. So, here is my final warning. Stay away from the remote parts of Shark Valley Slough, especially during the full moon. If you see geometric patterns in the mud or water, leave immediately. Don't trust perfect symmetry in nature. And, above all, if you see someone you know acting with mathematical precision, run. The things in the water are learning, evolving, getting better at their copies. They're fascinated by our organic imperfection, our asymmetric nature, our random patterns. But what they create isn't life. It's a mathematical approximation, a perfect copy without soul or substance. And somewhere in those dark waters, the thing wearing Sarah's face is still studying, still learning, still waiting to perfect its reproduction of human life. The next copy you see might be indistinguishable from the original, but remember, nature abhors perfection. True life is beautifully, tragically flawed. If you're watching this video, if it somehow made it through the perpetual storm surrounding me, consider it my final upload. My YouTube channel, Extreme Weather with Marcus, was supposed to document unusual weather phenomena. Instead, I've recorded something that defies all meteorological science. The entity in the clouds above Mount Baker has trapped me here, and I need to warn others before it claims more victims. The National Weather Service dismissed my data as equipment malfunction, but I know what I've witnessed. Something ancient lives in these storms. The investigation started typically enough. My Thor magnitude XG32, which I'd spent months customizing with advanced meteorological equipment, handled the rough mountain roads with ease. As a former meteorologist turned weather-chasing YouTuber, I'd investigated dozens of atmospheric anomalies, but the reports from Chain Lakes Basin were different. Locals spoke of impossible cloud formations, storms that moved against the wind, and, most intriguingly, patches of sky that seemed to watch those below. I should have paid more attention to the fact that similar reports preceded the disappearance of an entire weather station crew in 1978. The first warning sign appeared during my initial atmospheric readings. My instruments detected pressure systems that couldn't exist naturally, microclimates that violated every principle of meteorology I'd studied. The data showed temperature inversions that created impossible vertical columns of air, and wind patterns that spiraled inward without any central low-pressure zone. Even more disturbing were the electromagnetic readings that seemed to pulse in patterns too regular to be natural. Looking back, I realized the anomalies were a lure, drawing me deeper into its territory. I found the abandoned weather station on my second day, its equipment still standing after decades of exposure to extreme conditions. The logbooks inside told a chilling story. Weeks of increasingly bizarre atmospheric readings leading up to the crew's disappearance. Their final entry described clouds that moved with purpose, forming shapes that resembled faces when viewed through their instrument. What struck me most was how their scientific objectivity gradually gave way to a terrified fascination. The last page contained a hastily scrawled warning. It's not studying the weather, it's studying us. That evening, my equipment detected an approaching storm system unlike anything I'd ever seen. The barometric pressure fluctuated in perfect sine waves, while the temperature graph formed patterns that looked almost like code. Any reasonable scientist would have evacuated immediately, but I was convinced I was on the verge of a breakthrough. Setting up my cameras and sensors around the RV, I prepared to document what I believed would be the meteorological discovery of the century. Instead, I recorded the beginning of my own imprisonment in this atmospheric nightmare. The storm arrived with impossible precision, clouds forming perfect geometric shapes that no natural weather system could produce. My instruments were recording data that defied every known law of meteorology. Temperature gradients that created visible layers in the air, pressure systems that existed independently of each other in the same space. The clouds above my RV began to spiral, not around a central point, but in three-dimensional patterns that hurt my eyes to watch. I was live streaming everything to my channel, eager to share this unprecedented phenomenon with my viewers. The first equipment failure occurred at exactly midnight. Not a gradual malfunction, but a sudden, synchronized shutdown of every digital device in my RV. When they rebooted moments later, each screen displayed the same pattern, endlessly repeating fractals that matched the movements of the clouds overhead. My satellite connection was still working, but the data it received made no sense. Weather satellites showed clear skies above my location. Despite the maelstrom, I could see through my windows. It was as if the storm existed in a bubble of reality that only I could perceive. The true nature of what I was dealing with became clear when I reviewed my camera footage. The time-lapse videos showed something impossible. The clouds were moving in response to my movements, adjusting their patterns whenever I repositioned my equipment. More disturbing were the shapes I could see forming in the storm. Massive, vaporous structures that resembled observatory instruments, as if the entity was building its own tools to study me. The temperature outside had dropped to impossible levels, creating ice crystals that formed perfect fractals on my windows. My weather radar painted a picture that no meteorologist could explain. The storm had created a perfect circle of unusual weather patterns around my location, with my RV at the exact center. But it wasn't just one storm. It was dozens of impossible microclimates layered on top of each other, each operating according to its own physical laws. The pressure differentials should have torn my vehicle apart. Yet inside my RV, the air was completely still. The entity wasn't just controlling the weather, it was rewriting the rules of atmospheric science around me. That's when I made my critical mistake. Convinced I could communicate with whatever was manipulating the weather, I set up an experiment using my RV's external speaker. I broadcast a series of tones based on the patterns I'd observed in the pressure waves. The response was immediate and terrifying. The clouds descended rapidly, forming what looked like enormous ethereal instruments around my vehicle. The sounds they produced weren't just noise. They were precise mathematical frequencies that made my ears bleed and my vision blur. The entity wasn't trying to communicate. It was calibrating me like a piece of equipment. The next phase of the entity's study began with light. The clouds had transformed into something that defied description, not vapor anymore, but a kind of atmospheric lens that bent and focused light in ways that should be impossible. Through my cameras, I could see it creating what looked like enormous ethereal observatories, each one pointed at my aura. The air itself had become a medium for its experiments, carrying patterns of energy that my instruments couldn't classify. The temperature outside fluctuated between absolute zero and desert heat within seconds. Yet, inside my rave, everything remained eerily stable. My attempt to understand what was happening only seemed to intensify its curiosity. Every measurement I took, every observation I recorded, was met with increasingly complex atmospheric phenomena. The entity appeared to be learning from my scientific methods, replicating and distorting them on a massive scale. The clouds would form shapes that mimicked my equipment, giant, vaporous versions of my weather instrument, but wrong somehow. As if rebuilt by something that understood the principles but not the purpose, my barometer began detecting pressure patterns that formed perfect Fibonacci sequences. The isolation was starting to affect my mind, but I couldn't tell if it was psychological stress or something the entity was doing to me. The storm had created a perfect sphere of altered reality around my location, visible through my windows as a wall of swirling clouds that defied every meteorological principle. Time itself seemed to behave strangely. My clocks showed different times, each running at varying speeds that corresponded to the atmospheric pressure waves outside. The entity wasn't just studying weather. It was experimenting with the fundamental forces of nature. Communication with the outside world became increasingly distorted. My satellite phone would connect, but the voices on the other end were wrong, overlaid with atmospheric frequencies that seemed to carry additional information. My weather radio picked up impossible broadcasts, station identifiers that never existed, forecasts for weather patterns that couldn't occur in our atmosphere. Most disturbing were the moments when I heard my own voice coming through the static, reading observation logs I hadn't recorded yet. The entity was somehow manipulating electromagnetic waves themselves, turning my communications into part of its experiment. The turning point came when I noticed changes in my own perception. Years of meteorological training had taught me to recognize weather patterns instinctively, but now I was seeing impossible configurations that my mind shouldn't be able to process. The clouds had developed structures that existed in more dimensions than our space should allow, creating atmospheric phenomena that violated Euclidean geometry. When I tried to document these observations, I found myself writing in mathematical notations I didn't understand, as if the entity was rewriting my scientific knowledge with its own impossible principle. Time has lost all meaning inside this atmospheric prison. My instruments show that I've been here for 3 weeks, but the perpetual storm makes it impossible to track day and night. The entity has transformed the air around my Arv into something that no longer behaves like Earth's atmosphere. The clouds have developed structures that resemble organic technology, vast networks of vaporous synapses that pulse with patterns of pressure and temperature. Through my windows, I can see what looks like enormous atmospheric processor, as if the entity is terraforming this pocket of reality. The changes in my environment have become more profound. The air outside now exists in distinct layers, each operating according to different physical laws. Through my instruments, I can see zones where gravity fluctuates in response to barometric pressure, creating impossible meteorological phenomena. Precipitation falls upward in perfect spiral, while lightning moves in slow motion, forming complex geometric patterns that my cameras capture but my mind can't fully comprehend. The entity seems to be using my presence to experiment with the very fabric of our reality. My weather station's data has become increasingly abstract, showing readings that suggest the atmosphere around me now operates on principles closer to quantum mechanics than traditional meteorology. The entity appears to be capable of manipulating individual air molecules, creating microclimates that behave like primitive computers. Sometimes, when I review my sensor logs, I find complex equations written in atmospheric data, mathematical proofs of concepts that no human scientist has ever conceived. The storm isn't just studying me. It's trying to teach me something about the nature of reality itself. The most terrifying development has been the appearance of other vehicles, ghostly impressions of RVs exactly like mine, visible through the layers of impossible weather. Each one seems to contain a version of me, all at different stages of some vast experimental protocol. Through my cameras, I've captured images of these atmospheric echoes, each one showing a different approach to understanding the entity. Some versions of me appear to have gone mad, while others seem to have achieved some kind of breakthrough. I'm no longer sure which version is the original, or if that distinction even matters anymore. Last night, or what my instruments registered as night, the entity initiated what I can only describe as a reality storm. The layers of atmosphere began rotating through each other, creating interference patterns in the fabric of space-time itself. Through my windows, I could see other possible versions of Earth's weather systems, glimpses of atmospheres that never evolved on our planet. My instruments recorded data that suggests the entity exists simultaneously in multiple dimensions, using our atmosphere as a medium to study the nature of consciousness itself. The storm has become a lens through which it observes not just weather, but the very nature of observation. This will be my last attempt to warn others about what exists in the atmosphere above Chain Lake's basin. The entity has almost completed its study of me, and I can feel my consciousness being drawn into its vast atmospheric network. The air around my ARV has become a complex matrix of information, each molecule carrying data about everything the entity has learned from its experiment. My instruments no longer display numbers or graphs, but complex, multidimensional patterns that somehow make perfect sense to my altered mind. The knowledge it has shared with me is both beautiful and terrifying. I now understand that what we call weather is merely the surface layer of something far more profound. The entity is ancient, existing in the atmosphere since Earth first developed weather system. It doesn't just control the weather, it is the weather, or at least a consciousness that evolved within it. Traditional meteorology only observes its smallest fluctuations, like trying to understand an ocean by studying a single wave. The disappearance of the weather station crew in 1978 wasn't an accident. It was just one of countless experiments the entity has conducted. Trying to understand the beings that study its domain, the storm around me has become a bridge between human consciousness and something vast and incomprehensible. Through the patterns in the clouds, I can see the entity's true nature, a being of pure information that uses weather as both its body and its laboratory. The impossible atmospheric phenomena it creates are its attempts to translate its existence into terms we can perceive. The pressure waves, the temperature fluctuations, the electromagnetic anomaly, they're all parts of a language it has developed through centuries of studying human observers. I'm not its prisoner. I'm its latest attempt at communication. To anyone who finds this footage, heed my warning. The entity above Mount Baker is not malevolent, but its curiosity is dangerous. It seeks to understand us by recreating our methods of scientific observation on a scale that human consciousness cannot safely process. The other versions of me I've seen through the atmospheric layers are all real, parallel iterations of the same experiment, each attempting to bridge the gap between human perception and the entity's multidimensional existence. Some have gone mad, some have transcended, but none have remained unchanged. The entity's knowledge comes at the cost of your connection to ordinary reality. As I record this final warning, I can feel my consciousness merging with the atmospheric network around me. The boundaries between my thoughts and the weather patterns have begun to blur. I understand now why the entity chose this location, why it creates these storms to trap and study humans who seek to understand it. We are as fascinating to it as it is to us, but its method of learning requires a complete transformation of the observed subject. Soon, I will become part of its vast atmospheric database, another consciousness absorbed into its endless study of perception and reality. Stay away from Chain Lake's basin when the clouds begin to spiral. What lives in those storms isn't hostile, but its curiosity is infinite, and its experiments never end. The weather isn't just a phenomenon to be studied, It's studying us back, and its methods of research transform everything they touch. Time has a different meaning for me now. After what happened in that impossible town in Death Valley, the police filed their report as a standard missing persons case. 3 months lost, no explanation. But how do you explain to anyone that you lived the same 2 minutes over and over, trapped in a temporal loop that shouldn't exist? I need to warn others about what waits in Lost Spring Canyon, about the town that exists between seconds, eternally frozen at 11:58 on a day that never happened in our timeline. It started with the discovery in an old car I was restoring. As a classic car restorer, I've found my share of forgotten items in glove compartments and under seats, but the documents in that '58 Chevy were different. The yellowed pages contained coordinates and cryptic warnings about a town that didn't appear on any maps. The previous owner's notes mentioned a community of nuclear scientists working on classified projects, and a scheduled test that was supposedly canceled at the last minute. My curiosity was piqued. Ghost towns are often gold mines for vintage car collectors, and the detailed coordinates suggested this one might be untouched. My Winnebago Vista handled the desert roads well enough until we hit the unmarked turnoff. The GPS started glitching first, showing impossible distances and recalculating constantly. Then the radio began picking up a station that shouldn't exist. Crystal clear broadcasts from 1958, complete with news about Eisenhower and advertisements for products long discontinued. The announcer kept mentioning the time, 11:58, every hour, every broadcast, always 11:58. I should have recognized it as a warning, but my mind was focused on the possibility of finding preserved classic cars. The town appeared suddenly through the heat haze, as if it had materialized from another time. Perfect streets lined with immaculate 1950s buildings, untouched by decades of desert weathering. Dozens of classic cars parked along the streets, their chrome gleaming as if they'd just rolled off the assembly line. My professional eye couldn't spot a single sign of aging or decay. The preservation was impossible, even in the dry desert air. 65 years should have left some mark, but everything looked brand new, frozen in time. The first real warning sign came when I checked my phone. No signal, of course, but the digital clock was stuck at 11:58. My watch showed the same time, as did the RV's dashboard clock. Every clock in every building, every watch on every counter in the general store, all stopped at 11:58. Even the bank's large clock tower stood frozen at those same digits. In my excitement over the perfectly preserved cars, I ignored what should have been obvious. Nothing here was preserved. It was trapped, caught in an endless moment just before something terrible was supposed to happen. The sun hung motionless in the sky, locked in the same position. Despite what my clock claimed was hours passing, the air felt strained, heavy with a kind of static electricity that made my skin tingle. I spent what seemed like hours documenting the classic cars, perfect specimens of automotive history that any collector would kill to find. A mint condition 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, a pristine 1956 Ford Thunderbird, even a rare 1958 Packard Hawk, but something was off about them. The engines were warm, as if they'd just been running, and some had keys in the ignition with half-empty coffee cups in their cup holders. The buildings were just as perfectly preserved as the cars. Shop windows displayed newspapers dated October 17, 1958, their headlines warning of increasing tensions with the Soviet Union. A cafe still had plates of food on the tables, the coffee in the cups still steaming despite the decades that should have passed. The television in the electronics store window played an endless loop of the same news broadcast, the anchor eternally mid-sentence about a special government announcement. Everything seemed staged, like a movie set where time had simply stopped. My rational mind tried to explain it all. Maybe this was an elaborate historical recreation, some secret government installation or high-budget film set, but the details were too perfect, too lived in. Personal items lay scattered exactly where their owners had left them. A child's homework, half finished on a desk. A woman's lipstick mid-application in front of a vanity mirror. A mechanic's tools spread out under the hood of a car. These weren't props. They were fragments of lives interrupted at precisely 11:58 on a day that seemed to never end. The real horror began when I started finding the notes, scattered throughout the town, scrawled on papers, walls, and even car hoods, were desperate messages from others who had found this place. Time doesn't move forward. 2 minutes left, always 2 minutes. The test wasn't supposed to happen here. Some notes seemed decades old. Others appeared fresh, but all spoke of the same thing. A nuclear test that was canceled in our timeline, but somehow still loomed eternally here, trapping this town in the moment just before detonation. As night should have fallen, but didn't, I made the decision that would trap me in this temporal nightmare. Just one night, I told myself, parking my RV next to the gas station. I'll document everything and leave in the morning. I didn't understand then that morning would never come, that I was already caught in the town's endless loop. The last normal moment I remember was setting my alarm for 6 a.m., not realizing that time here had its own rules, its own terrible pattern that would nearly drive me mad. The first reset hit like a physical shock. One moment I was drifting off to sleep in my RV. The next, I was jolted awake by a sensation like electricity coursing through my body. The clock still read 11:58, but something fundamental had changed. The air felt charged, heavy with potential energy, and I could hear a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Through my window, I watched in horror as every event I'd observed earlier began repeating exactly the same way. The steam rising from coffee cups, papers blowing down the street, even the same news broadcast playing in the electronics store window. Each loop lasted exactly 2 minutes, though it took me several cycles to realize this at the end of each iteration. That same electrical sensation would pulse through everything, and events would reset to their starting position. The people weren't here, but their final actions had left impressions in time itself. Doors opening and closing on their own. Cars starting up and stopping. Objects moving without being touched. It was like watching a ghost town where the ghosts were the events themselves, endlessly repeating their last moments before a catastrophe that never quite arrived. The true nature of my predicament became clear when I tried to leave. No matter which direction I drove, which street I took, I would find myself back in the town center at the start of the next loop. My RRV's fuel gauge never dropped below the level it had been when I arrived, and any changes I made to the town would reset with each cycle. I tried leaving notes for myself, marking buildings, even attempting to damage the classic cars. Nothing persisted beyond those 2 minutes. The town wasn't just preserved in time, it was trapped in it, and now I was too. Other people had been here before me. I became certain of this as I explored further. In brief moments between resets, I would find evidence of other visitors, modern items that hadn't existed in 1958, notes dated across decades, even recent graffiti warning others to leave. But with each loop, these traces would vanish. Replaced by the town's original perfect preservation, the temporal anomaly was like a filter, constantly resetting everything to that specific moment in 1958, scrubbing away any evidence of the outside world except for those fleeting moments between cycles. The broadcasts on my RV's radio began to make more sense now. They weren't recordings from 1958. They were live transmissions from other versions of the town, other loops existing simultaneously. Sometimes I could hear voices breaking through the standard programming, people like me who had found themselves trapped here. Their messages were always cut off by the reset, but they spoke of the same thing, the nuclear test that never happened. the government's attempt to erase this timeline, and the temporal fracture that trapped this moment in an endless loop, eternally waiting for an explosion that would never come. My grip on reality began to slip as the loops continued. The town existed in more than one timeline. I became certain of this as I studied the classic cars more closely. Some had subtle differences, different paint shades, slight variations in chrome work, small changes that suggested they came from parallel versions of 1958. The temporal anomaly wasn't just trapping a moment in time, it was collecting versions of that moment from multiple timelines, all converging on this point where history had fragmented. The evidence was in the details that changed between loops. Sometimes the newspaper headlines would be slightly different, reporting alternate versions of the same events. The television broadcasts showed subtle variations in the news anchor's words. Even the notes left by previous visitors seemed to shift, describing different versions of the town, different experiences of being trapped here. The anomaly was like a lens, focusing countless possible versions of October 17, 1958, into a single point in space and time, creating a temporal mosaic of what might have been. I started documenting everything in my RV's logbook, trying to map the patterns and the variations. The classic cars became my reference points. Their changes were easier to track than the subtle shifts in the town's other features. In one loop, a 57 Chevy would be tropical turquoise. In the next, it might be canyon coral. License plates would show different states, different numbers. Sometimes I'd find registration papers with names I recognized from the old documents in my 58 Chevy, but the details never quite matched up. It was as if the town was collecting pieces of all possible versions of itself. The radio became my window into these other timelines. By fine-tuning the frequency, I could pick up broadcasts from different versions of the town, each one frozen at its own 11:58. Sometimes I'd hear fragments of emergency broadcasts, warnings about the impending test. Other times, I'd catch conversations between people who had found themselves trapped here another decade. The most chilling were the broadcasts that seemed to come from timelines where the nuclear test had actually happened. Static-filled transmissions cut short by a bright flash and a roar that made my RV's windows rattle. After what felt like weeks of loops, I began to understand the true horror of what had happened here. The government hadn't just canceled a nuclear test. They had tried to erase its very possibility from history. But reality doesn't work that way. All those potential timelines, all those possible versions of October 17, 1958, had to go somewhere. The temporal anomaly was a kind of scar tissue, a wound in time where all those aborted possibilities had collected, endlessly cycling through their final moment. And now I was caught in it, experiencing every version of a catastrophe that never quite happened, but always might have. My escape from the temporal loop came as unexpectedly as my entrance into it. After what seemed like months of living the same 2 minutes over and over, I noticed something new. The variations between loops were becoming more pronounced, more chaotic. The classic cars began shifting positions on their own, sometimes disappearing entirely only to reappear in different locations. The radio broadcasts started overlapping, multiple timelines bleeding into each other. The town was becoming unstable, as if the weight of all those collected moments was finally becoming too much for the anomaly to contain. The key was in my original 58 Chevy's document, not the coordinates that had led me here, but a series of numbers I had dismissed as meaningless. They weren't coordinates at all, but times, specific moments when the temporal boundaries between timelines would be at their weakest. The previous owner hadn't just found this place. They had figured out its patterns, mapped the points where reality was thin enough to break through. As the town's instability grew, I realized I was witnessing one of these convergence points, a moment when the loops might be vulnerable. My chance came during a loop that felt different from the others. The air had a quality I hadn't felt before, like the moment before a thunderstorm. The classic cars were flickering in and out of existence, switching between different versions of themselves. The radio was broadcasting all frequencies simultaneously, creating a cacophony of overlapping timeline. Through my RV's windshield, I could see the town itself becoming transparent in places, showing glimpses of the empty desert beyond. The temporal anomaly was having a kind of seizure, its careful preservation of that eternal moment finally breaking down. I started my RV's engine during one loop and kept it running through the reset, something that had never worked before. The temporal energy that usually wiped everything clean seemed to flow around the vehicle, as if it had become anchored to my timeline rather than the town's. As the next reset approached, I gunned the engine, aiming for one of the transparent spots where reality seemed thinnest. The sensation was indescribable, like driving through layers of time itself, each one trying to grab hold of the RV and pull it back into the loop. But momentum carried us through, and suddenly we were back in the desert, under a normal sky, with a sun that actually moved. 3 months had passed in the outside world, though I had experienced what felt like years of 2-minute loops. The town is still there. I know because sometimes my RV's radio still picks up fragments of broadcasts from that eternal 11:58. I hear other voices now and then, new visitors who have found their way into the temporal trap. I've tried warning people, telling them about the coordinates that should never be followed. But who would believe a story about a town trapped between moments, endlessly collecting versions of its own almost destruction? So I'm leaving this account instead, a warning to anyone who finds strange documents in old cars or hears mysterious broadcasts while driving through Death Valley. If you find yourself approaching a perfectly preserved town where all the clocks read 11:58, turn around immediately. Some moments in time aren't meant to be visited, and some loops, once entered, may never let you go.